When I saw him standing in the doorway of my bedroom, holding the appointment card I had carelessly left on the kitchen counter, my stomach tightened like a fist. "Was this for a massage?" he asked, his voice too casual, too even. I nodded, pretending it was nothing. "I cancelled it," I said, avoiding his eyes. What I didn't say was that the masseuse had cancelled it first. What I didn't say was that someone else had offered to replace that appointment, someone who shouldn't have. Someone who was standing just down the hallway. He handed the card back to me and walked off, unbothered, distracted by work emails and dinner plans. But I couldn't move. My fingers trembled as I folded the card and tucked it into a drawer. That appointment was supposed to help me breathe again. To feel something again. Instead, it unraveled a part of me I thought I'd locked away years ago. And now, everything had shifted. Because the touch that replaced the one I'd booked didn't just ease my muscles, it stirred something in me I wasn't ready to face. Not yet. But maybe if I tell you how it all started, you'll understand. Before I take you deeper into the part of myself I've tried so hard to silence, leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching this from, and answer honestly, have you ever craved something so quietly that it scared you more than anything else? The cancellation came just after lunch. A short, impersonal message: "Apologies, I need to reschedule, family emergency." It was the third time in a row. I stared at the screen for a while before locking it, pressing it too tightly in my hand. I'd been counting down the days to that massage. Not because my back ached, though it did, but because I needed something. A pause. A reset. Something just for me. He noticed I was tense, of course. My husband, I mean. He commented on it the way someone comments on the weather, from a distance, out of courtesy. "You should take a bath," he said without looking up from his screen. "That helps you sleep." I said nothing. What was the point? Later that afternoon, I was folding towels in the laundry room when he walked in, the other he. My stepson. He was staying with us while his apartment got some repairs done, something with pipes and rewiring. The timeline kept extending, but no one seemed to mind. Least of all him. He leaned on the doorframe and watched me for a beat before asking, "You okay?" I smiled, because that's what I do. "Yeah. Just tired." He didn't nod or shrug. He studied me, like he was deciding whether or not to believe me. Then, casually, too casually, he said, "You were supposed to have a massage today, right?" I blinked. "Yeah. Cancelled." "That sucks. I'm actually decent at that stuff. Had to learn some techniques back in college, roommate had chronic pain." I laughed it off. "Thanks, but I'll survive." He didn't push. Just smiled and walked away. I kept folding, my hands moving automatically while my mind stayed behind in that moment. That night, I found myself staring at the ceiling longer than usual. The bed felt too wide. He was asleep beside me, my husband, breathing steadily, unaware. His shoulder brushed mine, and I felt nothing. Not the spark, not the familiarity. Just skin. The next morning, I padded into the kitchen early, drawn more by habit than hunger. He was already there. The other one. Coffee in hand, bare feet on tile. He looked up and said, "Morning." "Morning," I echoed, reaching for a mug. We stood in silence, the kind that wasn't uncomfortable but wasn't easy either. He broke it. "If you ever want to take me up on that offer, let me know." I wasn't joking. I didn't answer right away. I looked out the window at the garden, still damp with dew, and thought about how little I did for myself anymore. How many things I filed under not important because no one else noticed them. Maybe that was the worst part, feeling like no one noticed when you started disappearing. He added, "Sometimes touch helps more than people think." I turned to face him, caught off guard by the sincerity in his voice. "I'll let you know," I said, and left the kitchen without coffee. The rest of the day blurred. I made a grocery list I didn't need. I folded clothes that were already folded. I moved through rooms like a guest in my own house. Every so often, I caught myself replaying his voice in my head. That night, I stood in the mirror after my shower, wrapped in a towel, staring at my reflection. My skin was aging, of course it was. But there were still pieces of me that felt alive. I touched my collarbone, traced the edge of my jaw. I was still here. I knocked lightly on his door. He opened it almost instantly, like he'd been waiting. "Still offering?" I asked. His face didn't change. He nodded once, stepped aside, and motioned to the guest room. I followed. The room was quiet. A lamp cast a low amber glow. There was a folded blanket on the edge of the bed. A small bottle of oil. "I can stop any time," he said softly. "I know," I replied, lying face down on the bed, the towel still around me. His hands were warm. Firm. Gentle. He started at my shoulders, and I felt the tension begin to melt, not just in my muscles, but deeper. In places I hadn't realized were clenched. He didn't speak. Neither did I. Minutes passed. Or maybe more. I don't know. But when his fingers brushed lower than they had to, not by much, just enough to notice, I didn't flinch. I held my breath. Then exhaled slowly. My skin was electric. Not from arousal. From being seen. I turned my head slightly. Our eyes met. I didn't plan it. We kissed. And I left. Immediately. Without a word. My hands shook as I closed my bedroom door behind me. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the silence, letting the weight of what had just happened settle in. It hadn't been a seduction. It hadn't even been deliberate. But it had happened. And now, I couldn't pretend it hadn't. The following morning, I expected to feel guilt, the heavy, suffocating kind that wraps around your chest and doesn't let go. But instead, I felt blank. Not numb, not calm. Just blank. I moved through the house like I usually did, making coffee, tidying up the kitchen, watering the plant near the window that had begun to lean toward the sun more desperately with each passing day. My body moved, but my thoughts hovered somewhere behind me, just out of reach. He wasn't in the kitchen this time. I half expected him to be, leaning against the counter again, coffee in hand, eyes searching my face. But it was quiet. Too quiet. I poured my coffee and sat alone at the table, listening to the ticking of the clock and the hum of the refrigerator. I didn't want to go over what had happened. I didn't want to assign it a meaning or define it. Yet, every sip I took seemed to trigger a different memory from last night. The weight of his hands. The heat of his breath. The moment our eyes met. The moment we kissed. We kissed. Just that. Nothing more. But enough. Later, I heard the front door open and shut gently. I didn't get up to check. A small part of me was relieved. Maybe he was going out. Maybe I wouldn't have to face him yet. But the relief didn't last. 10 minutes later, I heard his voice from down the hallway. He wasn't gone. He had just stepped outside. Somehow that detail settled oddly in my chest. The day dragged. My husband called to say he'd be late again, another meeting, another obligation. I nodded along, muttered some response, and hung up quickly. I wasn't angry at him. Not really. I just didn't want to hear his voice right then. It felt like it didn't belong in the same space where my thoughts were circling. In the afternoon, I went out for a walk, hoping to clear my head. The air was warm, the kind that presses gently against your skin without suffocating. I walked to the park 3 blocks away, the same one we used to go to when we first moved into this neighborhood. It was a modest place, benches under old trees, a worn path for joggers, a playground that always seemed a little too empty. I sat on a bench and watched the wind play with the leaves, wondering how I had ended up here. Not just in the park. In this feeling. After a while, I sensed someone approach. I didn't have to look up. I knew it was him. He sat beside me without saying anything. The silence stretched, but not in a painful way. It was the kind of quiet that had its own texture, not soft, not hard. Just real. I didn't mean to make things complicated, he said, his voice low, barely above the wind. I know, I replied. That was all I could manage. Neither of us moved. We just sat, letting the world move around us. Birds flew by. A dog barked in the distance. A couple walked past, hand in hand, laughing about something that no longer mattered once it reached our ears. I thought about saying more. About addressing what happened, putting words to it. But I didn't know what to say. And maybe he didn't either. Instead, he handed me a paper cup. Coffee. I hadn't noticed he was holding 2. I took it, and our fingers brushed for the briefest second. Thank you, I said. We sat like that for a while, sipping quietly. On the walk back, we stayed side by side, but with a noticeable gap between us. It wasn't avoidance. It was caution. Every step felt measured, like we were walking a wire stretched between rooftops. And yet, it didn't feel wrong. Just fragile. At home, I went straight to the bedroom. I didn't know why, maybe because I needed a place that was mine, a space where I didn't have to see my own confusion reflected in someone else's eyes. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the closet, remembering a time when I used to choose outfits with purpose, not just habit. A time when what I wore had something to do with how I felt, not just what was clean or appropriate. I stood and opened the door slowly. Inside, among the predictable blouses and practical sweaters, there was a set I hadn't worn in years, silk, deep green, tucked away behind a robe I didn't even like. I pulled it out, ran my fingers along the fabric, and held it against my chest. For a second, I didn't see myself in the mirror. I saw who I used to be, or maybe who I still was, under layers of compromise. I didn't try it on. I didn't need to. Just holding it was enough to remind me I was still capable of wanting something. Dinner came and went with little ceremony. I made pasta. Ate alone. My husband texted that he'd eat out with clients. I didn't reply. I didn't even read the full message. I left the phone face down on the table and finished my wine slowly, letting the silence return like an old friend. Later that night, I heard movement in the hallway. Soft footsteps, not hurried. I didn't open the door, but I stood behind it for a moment, hand resting on the knob, unsure of what I was hoping for. I went to bed early, but sleep didn't come easily. I turned onto my side, then my back, then my side again. I counted the seconds between the creaks of the house, the ticking of the bedside clock, the distant hum of traffic through the window. At some point, just before sleep finally claimed me, I thought again about the kiss. Not just how it felt, but what it meant. Not just to him. To me. Because for the first time in a long while, someone had seen me. Not as a wife. Not as a homemaker. Not as someone who needed things done for her. Just me. And maybe that was the part one wasn't ready to admit, that I needed to be seen. Not wanted, not desired. Just seen. And now that I had been. I couldn't unfeel it. The morning began like most others, with the quiet rustle of the curtains brushing against the window frame and the soft glow of sunlight creeping across the hardwood floor. I lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, my body still but my mind already sifting through the emotions I hadn't dealt with the night before. The kiss lingered in my thoughts like a misplaced object you keep running into, a reminder, an interruption, a presence. I got out of bed, moving slowly, deliberately. The robe I wrapped around myself felt heavier than usual. Not in weight, but in meaning. Like I was covering more than my body. Like I was shielding something I wasn't ready to acknowledge in the light. Downstairs, the kitchen was already warm from the early sunlight, casting long amber streaks across the counter. He wasn't there. I didn't know whether I felt disappointed or relieved. I busied myself with small tasks, wiping the counter, rearranging the fruit bowl, boiling water I didn't plan to use. It was a strange kind of ritual, one that helped quiet the noise in my head. By the time I heard him come down the stairs, I had already retreated to the laundry room, pretending to sort linens that were already folded. I didn't want to face him yet. Or maybe I did, and that's exactly why I avoided it. He didn't call out to me. He passed through the hallway with measured steps and didn't stop. That silence between us stretched again, invisible but thick, a thread that pulled at me no matter how far I tried to step away. Later that afternoon, I decided to go for a run. It wasn't something I usually did, but my body was restless, full of energy I didn't know what to do with. I pulled on a pair of old leggings and a loose t-shirt, tied my hair back, and stepped outside. The air was cool, the kind that stung just enough to wake you up. I started down the street, my pace awkward at first, but then settling into a rhythm. The neighborhood was quiet, a few cars, a dog behind a fence, wind moving through the trees. I ran past the elementary school, past the park, past the bakery where I used to stop on Sundays. My feet knew the path even if my mind didn't. I was chasing something, or maybe outrunning it. I wasn't sure. About halfway through the run, I paused at the park. I bent over, hands on my knees, catching my breath. My chest ached, not from exertion, but from the surge of something that had been building all day. Regret? Guilt? Longing? I wasn't sure which feeling was which anymore. They all blurred together. I walked the rest of the way home, trying to slow my heartbeat. When I arrived, the house was quiet again. Still. I stepped into the foyer, removed my shoes, and stood there, uncertain of where to go next. He was in the living room, sitting on the edge of the couch, reading. Or pretending to. When he looked up and saw me, his expression didn't shift. He nodded once, politely. I nodded back. That was all. I went upstairs, showered, changed, and stood in front of my mirror again. That mirror was starting to become more of a witness than a tool. I looked older that day. Or maybe just tired. My eyes held something I couldn't name. A kind of searching, a kind of questioning. I chose my clothes carefully for the first time in weeks. Not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because I wanted to feel like I was dressing for something. For a version of myself I had left behind somewhere. Dinner was quiet. My husband wasn't home yet, a late meeting again. I set 2 places out of habit, then removed one when I remembered. The other he, walked into the kitchen just as I was sitting down. We exchanged glances but didn't speak. I gestured toward the extra plate, and he accepted the silent invitation. We ate in near silence, the only sounds the clink of silverware and the occasional exhale between bites. At one point, our forks met over the same bowl of vegetables, and our hands brushed. We froze for just a second. Then continued as if nothing had happened. After dinner, I washed the dishes. He dried them. The quiet between us was no longer awkward. It was familiar. But it wasn't simple. There was a weight to it. A presence. When I finished, I turned off the faucet and stood still, staring out the window above the sink. The yard outside was dark now, only shadows and the vague outlines of trees. I didn't turn around, but I could feel him standing behind me, not too close, not too far. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. I nodded. I didn't speak. Words felt too fragile. He stayed for a moment longer, then walked away. I remained there for a while, staring into the dark. My fingers played with the edge of the dish towel, twisting it, smoothing it, twisting it again. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just breathed. Later that night, in bed, I lay awake long after the house had gone quiet. My husband still hadn't returned. Or if he had, I hadn't heard him. I stared at the ceiling again, my old companion, my silent confidant. I kept going back to the bench in the park. To the silence over coffee. To the way his eyes didn't accuse or demand. They just saw. And that was what terrified me. Because once you've been seen, really seen, it's hard to go back to being invisible. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't have a plan. I wasn't even sure what I wanted. But I knew something had shifted. In me. Around me. And whatever it was, it wouldn't go back to the way it was before. The days started to fold into each other. There was a rhythm to everything, a routine I had built over the years that still functioned even when my mind didn't. Morning coffee, a walk around the garden, light chores, quiet dinners. On the surface, nothing had changed. But underneath, everything had. I could feel it in the way I breathed, the way my body responded to silence, the way my skin seemed aware of the air brushing over it. My husband was home more that week, but not present. He was working late into the night in his office, which was just down the hall, and yet he felt miles away. We spoke in short exchanges, groceries, phone bills, reminders to water the plants. There was no hostility, no coldness. Just absence. It wasn't new. I had just grown used to it. But now, I noticed it more. I felt it like a hole. One evening, as I was clearing the table, he mentioned that he'd be leaving for a 2-day conference at a hotel on the coast. He spoke while checking his emails, not even lifting his eyes to meet mine. I said, "Okay," and he kissed me on the cheek as he walked out of the room. That was it. I didn't ask questions. I didn't pretend to care more than I did. But once he was gone, a strange calm settled over me, the kind that comes not from freedom, but from stillness. The first night without him, I sat on the living room couch with a blanket over my legs and a glass of wine that I barely sipped. The television played something forgettable in the background, but I wasn't watching. I was listening, not for sounds, but for stillness. I felt the shape of the house change without him. The silence became something else. Not empty. Just different. It was late when I heard footsteps in the hallway. I turned my head and saw him, the one who now occupied more space in my thoughts than I was comfortable admitting. He looked surprised to see me still awake. I didn't say anything. I just moved the blanket aside, a quiet gesture, and he sat at the other end of the couch. Not too close. Not far. We didn't speak for a long while. The show kept playing. The wine remained untouched. Then, I said, "I can't sleep when it's too quiet." He nodded like he understood. Maybe he did. I didn't know what I wanted in that moment. Only that I didn't want to feel alone in that way, the kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being without someone, but from being with people who don't see you. Eventually, he stood and said goodnight. I watched him walk away and felt something stretch between us again, something invisible intense. The next morning, I woke up early. I stood by the window for a while, watching the sunlight move across the lawn. I thought about leaving the house, going to the market, running errands. But none of it felt necessary. Instead, I made myself a proper breakfast: eggs, toast, even cut fruit. I sat down at the table and ate in silence, enjoying the rare feeling of doing something solely for myself. Later that day, I passed him in the hallway. Our eyes met, but we didn't speak. He was holding a book. I was holding a basket of clean laundry. It should have been unremarkable. But something passed between us. A pause. A question. A memory. In the afternoon, I sat on the back patio with a book I couldn't focus on. The garden was overgrown in places, weeds curling up through the cracks in the stones. I noticed that kind of thing more now. The small neglects. The quiet declines. I wondered when I had stopped caring about those details. He came outside after a while, a bottle of water in his hand. He asked if he could join me. I nodded. We sat there for a long time, both pretending to read. The silence between us was more comfortable now, less sharp. But still full. I closed my book and said, "Do you ever feel like you're stuck somewhere, but you don't know where exactly?" He looked at me for a long time before answering. "All the time," he said. We didn't elaborate. The conversation didn't go further. But those two words sat between us like an unspoken agreement. That evening, after dinner, I found myself lingering in the hallway outside his room. I had no reason to be there. I just stood for a moment, then walked away. The house grew quiet again. The kind of quiet that hums. I returned to the guest bedroom, the one with the soft lighting and the scent of lavender from an old diffuser. I lay down on the bed, fully clothed, not intending to sleep. Just to think. The bed felt warmer than mine. Or maybe it was just the way the light settled across the sheets. A knock on the door pulled me from my thoughts. I sat up. He stood there, uncertain. He didn't step inside. "I just wanted to check if you were okay," he said. I nodded. "I'm fine. Just thinking." He lingered for a moment, then nodded in return and started to turn away. "Wait," I said, before I even knew why. He looked back. "Could you stay for a bit? Just to talk?" He hesitated, then stepped inside and sat on the chair near the window. We talked. Not about anything deep. Just small things. His classes. A book he'd read. A trip I'd always wanted to take but never had. His voice was low, and mine even lower. But beneath the words, something else moved, not tension exactly. Not expectation. Just a presence. Eventually, we ran out of things to say. But neither of us moved. The light from the hallway filtered softly through the door, casting long shadows across the floor. "I should go," he said, finally. I nodded. "Thank you for staying." He left without another word. I remained on the bed, staring at the ceiling, tracing the shadows across the room with my eyes. The house was quiet again, but not empty. Not quite. That night, I slept in the guest room. Not because I needed to. But because I wanted to. Because that room, with its warmth and silence, felt more like mine than the one I had shared for years. And as I drifted off, I realized I hadn't thought of my husband once that evening. Not in memory. Not in longing. Not even in guilt. The next morning started slower than usual. I stayed in bed longer than I typically allowed myself, curled under the blanket in the guest room, watching the light filter through the blinds as it painted soft lines across the floor. I felt a strange kind of stillness inside me, not entirely peaceful, but not chaotic either. It was more like a pause, the kind you take before you exhale after holding your breath too long. Eventually, I forced myself up, wrapped the blanket around my shoulders, and moved to the kitchen. The house was quiet again. My husband had texted late the night before that his meetings had gone long and he'd be staying at the conference hotel another night. I read the message once and set the phone down. No reply. There didn't seem to be a reason to send one. The smell of coffee drifted through the kitchen as I brewed a pot. I poured a cup and sat at the table, cradling it in both hands, staring out the window. The garden still looked overgrown. I made a mental note to trim it, then let the thought slip away without resistance. He walked into the kitchen not long after, barefoot, hair slightly tousled, carrying that calm presence that was becoming more familiar than it should have been. He greeted me with a soft morning, and I returned the word quietly, not lifting my eyes from my cup. He poured his own coffee and joined me at the table. The silence between us wasn't tense anymore. It had become something else, a space where things were acknowledged without being spoken. That was, until he looked up and said, "Did you sleep okay?" I nodded. I did. "I'm glad," he said, and then took a sip of his coffee, eyes cast down. After breakfast, I kept myself busy, vacuuming a rug that didn't need it, organizing the medicine cabinet, checking expiration dates. I kept moving because stillness was beginning to feel dangerous, like it would make room for feelings I didn't yet know how to process. By mid-afternoon, I found myself staring at the large closet in my bedroom. I opened it slowly and ran my fingers along the row of blouses and dresses I hadn't worn in what felt like forever. Somewhere behind the practical neutrals and safe choices, I found a summer dress I had forgotten I owned. Soft blue, light fabric, sleeveless. I held it up to my body in the mirror and stared at the reflection. I changed into it without much thought, then added a light scarf, purely out of habit. When I walked past the hallway mirror, I caught a glimpse of myself. Something subtle had shifted. I didn't look younger. I didn't look drastically different. But there was a softness in my expression, one I hadn't seen in years. He was outside, working on the small patio near the garden. When he looked up and saw me stepping out with 2 glasses of lemonade, he smiled, not widely, not suggestively, just warmly. I handed him a glass, and we sat side by side on the bench, the wooden slats creaking gently beneath us. We spoke about small things again. Music. The strange shift in weather. A memory he had from school that made me laugh, a short, unexpected burst of laughter that left me momentarily breathless. The conversation drifted. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the lawn. I leaned back and closed my eyes for a moment, letting the warmth wash over my face. When I opened them again, he was looking at me, not staring, just observing. There was something kind in his eyes. Something steady. I turned my gaze back to the garden. Sometimes I forget what it's like to be looked at. There was a long pause before he replied. You shouldn't have to forget. That sentence stayed with me, even after we went inside. Dinner was light, a salad, roasted vegetables, nothing elaborate. We ate without background music or television. Just the clinking of silverware and the occasional comment. The air between us was still, but not empty. Something was building. Not fast. Not rushed. But undeniable. After we cleared the dishes, I stood in the kitchen, drying my hands on a towel, and said without planning it, "Would you help me with my shoulders again? They've been stiff." He looked at me for a moment, and I saw the hesitation. Not resistance. Just awareness. Then he nodded. We walked to the guest room together, neither of us saying anything. The quiet wasn't awkward, it was careful. Like we both knew the weight of each step. I sat on the edge of the bed, back straight, and slowly unwrapped the scarf from around my neck, placing it on the chair beside me. He stood behind me, his hands hovering for a moment before they gently settled on my shoulders. The first touch made me close my eyes. His hands were warm and firm, moving with a kind of patience that wasn't just about muscles. It was about listening. He worked silently, thumbs pressing into tension points, fingers gliding over skin that hadn't been touched with care in so long. I felt my breath deepen, my chest rise and fall with a rhythm that had nothing to do with arousal, but everything to do with presence. When I turned around slowly to thank him, our eyes met again. We kissed. I didn't plan it. I didn't even lean forward. But we kissed. And when I pulled back, I didn't apologize. He didn't either. Instead, we sat there in silence again, the air between us thick with something fragile and electric. I finally stood and said, "I think I need some air." He nodded, stepping aside. I walked through the house barefoot, out onto the back patio. The night air was cooler now. I wrapped my arms around myself, standing under the stars, listening to the sounds of the world that didn't know, or care, what had just happened inside. I didn't feel shame. I didn't feel triumph. I felt human. Fully, achingly human. And that, more than anything, terrified me. Because now, I wasn't just crossing a line. I was changing. And change, once it begins, has a way of spreading. Quietly. Completely. Irrevocably. The next morning, the weight of everything that had happened lingered in the air before I even opened my eyes. I lay in bed, still and quiet, as if moving would confirm that the night before wasn't a dream. But I knew it hadn't been. The memory wasn't hazy or half-formed. It was vivid, clear, and uncomfortably real. I finally rose, wrapping myself in the same soft robe I had worn the previous morning, and walked to the kitchen. The house was still. Too still. He wasn't there. His absence created a kind of echo in the rooms, a silence that felt intentional. I busied myself with breakfast, though I had no appetite. Toast browned too quickly. I forgot the coffee filter. I stood at the sink longer than necessary, watching birds gather near the edge of the garden, their movements effortless. I envied them for their clarity, for the absence of complication in their world. Later that morning, I found myself walking through the house aimlessly. I touched familiar objects, framed photos, the corner of the hallway table, a worn armrest on the living room chair, as if grounding myself in what had always been. But everything looked different now. Not dramatically. Just slightly off-axis. Slightly unsettled. I went to the laundry room, more out of habit than need. Folding clothes had always calmed me, given me a sense of order. I opened the dryer, warm air brushing my face, and pulled out a small load of towels. As I folded the first one, I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't turn immediately. I knew it was him. We stood in silence, my hands continuing their slow work. "I'm going out for a bit," he said, his voice carefully neutral. I nodded. Okay. He didn't say where. I didn't ask. The door closed softly behind him. I stayed there for a few more minutes, holding a towel that didn't need folding anymore. The rest of the day passed in fragments. I tried to distract myself, dusted bookshelves, reorganized the spice rack, trimmed back the plants near the window. But my mind wandered constantly, tugged back to the weight of that moment. That kiss. That feeling. It wasn't just the kiss. It was what it meant. What it unlocked. What it disrupted. In the late afternoon, I sat in the sunroom with a cup of tea, watching shadows lengthen across the floor. The warmth of the tea did little to settle the restlessness in my chest. I kept glancing at the clock, as if expecting something to happen. as if the passing of time would deliver a verdict or bring clarity. When I finally heard the front door open, my body reacted before my mind could catch up. A subtle shift in posture. A quiet inhalation. He stepped into the hallway and paused, as if sensing that I was nearby. I didn't move. I didn't speak. Eventually, he walked past the sunroom, and our eyes met briefly. He gave a small nod, polite and distant, then disappeared down the hallway. That evening, I made dinner alone. I didn't call him to eat. I wasn't sure if I wanted to. I sat at the table with a plate of roasted vegetables and rice, eating slowly, chewing without tasting. The house remained quiet. He didn't come. After dinner, I washed the dishes with more care than usual. Every motion was deliberate, every dish dried and stacked neatly. It gave me something to focus on. Something to control. Later, I walked out to the backyard. The air had cooled, and the sky was beginning to darken. I stood near the edge of the garden, barefoot in the grass, arms wrapped around myself. I closed my eyes and tried to remember what it felt like to not question everything. I didn't hear him approach, but I sensed his presence. "I thought you might be out here," he said softly. I opened my eyes and turned slightly, but didn't face him fully. "I needed air," I replied. He stood beside me, not too close, looking out over the same yard. We didn't speak for a while. The sound of a breeze moved through the leaves. A car passed distantly on the road. Somewhere nearby, wind chimes clinked faintly. "I've been thinking," he said eventually. "So have I." He nodded. I didn't mean to complicate things. I looked down at my feet. Neither did I. Another silence. "I'm not sure what happens now," he said. Me neither. The simplicity of our exchange was more painful than any long conversation might have been. I finally turned to face him. "But we both know it can't stay like this." He didn't argue. He just looked at me with something like acceptance in his eyes. When I walked back inside, I didn't look back. That night, I didn't sleep in the guest room. I returned to the bedroom I shared with my husband. The sheets were still tucked in, undisturbed. His pillow still held the shape of the last night he slept on it. I climbed into bed and lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling once again. The ceiling had become familiar, a surface on which I projected every question, every doubt. I replayed the day in my head, the distance, the silences, the small sentences that carried more weight than they should have. And beneath it all, the awareness that something had shifted in me permanently. I couldn't go back to pretending. The next morning, I woke early and sat at the edge of the bed, watching the room slowly brighten with the rising sun. My chest felt heavy, but my mind was still. Not clear, but still. I knew the quiet wouldn't last forever. My husband would be home soon. And whatever came next, I would have to face it, not as someone who had simply made a mistake, but as someone who had been forced to confront herself in a way she never expected. Because that's what it had become now, not just about what had happened, but about who I was when it did. The day began with a silence that was somehow different from the others. Not heavier, not lighter, just more aware. The house, the walls, the floor beneath my feet, everything seemed to listen more closely as I moved through it. My husband had texted the night before. His meetings had ended earlier than expected, and he'd be home sometime late this afternoon. The message was brief, emotionless, a simple update. I stared at it for a long time before locking my phone and setting it face down. I dressed more carefully that morning. Not with the intention to impress anyone, there was no one to see me, but because I needed to feel put together. Controlled. I chose a cream-colored blouse with sleeves that flowed just past the elbow, soft against my skin. Loose slacks, flat shoes. Hair pulled back. I wanted the outside to feel still, even if the inside didn't. He was already in the kitchen when I walked in. He looked up from the newspaper, yes, a real one, and offered a gentle nod. There was no tension, no awkwardness, but the air felt thick with something unnamed. I poured my coffee and sat down across from him. He didn't speak. Neither did I. Eventually, he folded the paper and pushed it aside. We ate breakfast in quiet, the clinking of cutlery against ceramic the only sound between us. When I stood to rinse my plate, he said, almost too softly, "Are you okay?" I paused. "Yes," I said. Then added, "I think." He nodded once. We didn't need to dissect it. The answer was enough. That afternoon, the hours moved differently. Every minute felt longer, stretched by anticipation. I kept checking the clock without meaning to. My husband would be home soon. I wasn't nervous, exactly. I wasn't afraid. But I felt like I was holding my breath, and I didn't know when I'd be able to release it. Around 2, I decided to go out. I needed space, real space. Not just another room, not just a different corner of the house. I needed distance. I drove without much intention, ending up on the outskirts of town where the traffic faded and the air smelled like eucalyptus and dry earth. I found a small park, mostly empty, with benches overlooking a narrow lake. I sat there for over an hour, watching the wind move across the water's surface. It was oddly soothing. A kind of stillness that didn't demand anything from me. Eventually, I drove home. I expected to feel different when I stepped back inside, but everything was still as I left it. The scent of the lavender diffuser. The rhythm of the refrigerator. The quiet. I stood in the entryway for a long moment before moving toward the hallway. His door was ajar. I didn't knock. I didn't step in. I simply paused in front of it. He looked up from his laptop, sitting cross-legged on the edge of the bed. Our eyes met. "Do you have plans tonight?" I asked, my voice calm. He closed the laptop slowly. "No." I hesitated, then said, "Would you come with me?" "Just for a short trip." He studied me for a second, not questioning, not pressing. "Yes." We didn't speak much while packing. I gathered only the essentials, a small overnight bag, a change of clothes, a bottle of water. He did the same. No details. No explanations. It wasn't an escape. It wasn't a secret. It was something else entirely, something undefined, suspended in time. We drove in silence. The road curved gently through fields and tree-lined backroads, the kind that rarely see more than 2 or 3 cars in an hour. The sky turned golden as the sun dipped lower, the air filled with that warm stillness that only comes at the edge of evening. We checked into a modest hotel just outside the city. Nothing luxurious, but clean, quiet, and anonymous in a way that felt almost peaceful. We didn't request separate rooms, but we didn't discuss it either. It simply happened, 2 names, 1 key. Inside, the room was simple, 2 chairs by the window, a queen-sized bed, a small table, beige curtains that moved slightly with the breeze from the open window. The view overlooked a small grove of trees, where the light filtered through like honey. I placed my bag on the bed and opened the window wider. The room filled with the scent of pine and cool air. I sat on the chair by the window and watched as the light shifted across the carpet. He sat opposite me, hands resting in his lap. For a while, neither of us moved. There was no tension, no urgency. Only quiet. At some point, I stood and walked to the bathroom. Washed my hands. Looked at myself in the mirror. My face was calm, more than I expected. I didn't look like someone caught in a storm. I looked like someone on the edge of something, an end, a beginning, I couldn't tell. When I stepped out of the bathroom, the room had darkened slightly. He was standing now, near the bed, looking out the window. The fading light traced the side of his face. We didn't say anything. We didn't need to. We spent the night together. I won't tell you how. I won't tell you what happened second by second, touch by touch. That's not the part that matters. What matters is how I felt afterward. Not exhilarated. Not destroyed. Just still. Fully, achingly, still. I woke before dawn. The room was dim, the only light the pale gray of early morning creeping in under the curtain. I sat up quietly and looked at him. He was still asleep, peaceful, unaware of my gaze. I slipped out of bed and stood by the window, pulling the curtain back slightly to look out at the grove of trees. The leaves moved gently in the breeze, like they always had. The world hadn't changed. Not really. But I had. Not because of what happened. Because I allowed it. Because I needed something I hadn't been able to name until now. Because, for the first time in years, I had stepped into a space that wasn't defined by anyone else's expectations. Not my husband's. Not society's. Not even his. Only mine. And that knowledge, quiet, steady, unshakable, was the most intimate thing of all. We drove back in the early morning light, the air outside still cool and untouched by the heat of the day. The roads were nearly empty, and the silence between us was comfortable, not heavy. I kept my eyes on the horizon, watching the way the sky shifted slowly from pale blue to gold. There was something calming about the way the day moved forward, whether we were ready or not. He didn't speak during the drive, and neither did I. There wasn't much to say. Words would have only complicated something that was already fragile. Instead, I let the rhythm of the road hold me, each passing mile gently untangling what remained tense inside me. When we arrived back at the house, it felt smaller than I remembered. Not in size, but in presence. I stepped out of the car and stood in the driveway for a moment, staring at the front door. The house we returned to was not the same house we had left. Or maybe it was, and I was the one who had changed. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was still, familiar. The scent of the lavender diffuser lingered faintly, mixed now with something older, perhaps the dust that had settled in our absence. He followed me in but paused in the entryway, waiting. I turned slightly toward him and nodded. He gave me a faint smile, one filled with understanding but no assumptions. Then he walked down the hallway to his room without a word, his footsteps soft against the floor. I stood alone for a long moment, absorbing the quiet. My bag hung loosely from my hand. The silence of the house felt thicker than before, as if it had absorbed the weight of everything we brought back with us. I took my things upstairs and set them down in the bedroom. The bed was still perfectly made, untouched since the morning we left. I sat at the edge, placing my hands on my knees, and closed my eyes. My breathing was slow, controlled, deliberate. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just breathed. Later that day, my husband returned. I heard the sound of the front door, the familiar way it clicked shut, the weight of his suitcase being placed beside the wall. His voice called out, casual, routine, "I'm back." I answered from the kitchen, my voice steady. "Welcome home." He entered a few minutes later, loosened his tie, and reached into the refrigerator for a bottle of water. He glanced at me, then kissed my cheek, just like always. I let him. He talked about the conference, how the turnout was better than expected, how one of the presenters canceled at the last minute, how the hotel food was forgettable. I nodded, asked the right questions, gave the right reactions. The entire conversation moved like a script we both knew by heart. But as he spoke, I realized I felt almost nothing. No anger. No resentment. No guilt. Just distance. A space between us that I no longer knew how to cross. That evening, I made dinner as usual. He joined me at the table, complimented the meal in passing, scrolled through his phone while chewing. I watched him, not with judgment, but with a strange detachment. I had once memorized every wrinkle in his face. Now I struggled to connect with the man in front of me. When he left the table to take a call, I remained seated, staring at my hands. They were steady. Clean. I placed them flat on the table, palm down, and stared at them as if trying to recognize them again. I heard him laughing in the next room, something about a client's mistake. His voice felt like it belonged in another house. Another version of my life. One I wasn't sure I wanted to return to. Later, as I walked through the hallway, I passed by the room where he was staying. The door was cracked open, the light spilling out into the hallway like a quiet invitation. But I didn't enter. I didn't even pause. I simply kept walking. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling once more, the same ceiling that had witnessed my doubts, my silence, my unraveling. The sheets felt too clean. The room too still. The air too quiet. I closed my eyes and waited for sleep to come, but it stayed at a distance, just out of reach. I kept thinking about the difference between presence and attention. My husband had always been present. Physically. Predictably. But he had stopped paying attention long ago. Maybe I had too. Maybe that's how we got here, drifting silently, each of us assuming the other was fine simply because neither of us said otherwise. In the morning, I awoke early and found the house already partially awake. My husband had left for work. A note was on the counter. Meeting at 8, back by dinner. Love you. I stared at the note, then folded it once and placed it in the drawer without reading it again. Later, while folding laundry, I noticed something small. One of his shirts had a button missing. I found the button in the machine, tiny and harmless. I placed it in the drawer with the note. Throughout the day, I moved quietly. I tended to things that didn't need tending. I watered the plants. I rearranged the books on the shelf. I wiped down surfaces that weren't dirty. I wasn't trying to distract myself. I was simply trying to reconnect to the world I had created, the world I had slowly drifted away from. In the afternoon, I sat by the window in the sunroom, the light warm on my skin. I heard footsteps approaching. He stepped in, paused when he saw me there, then smiled softly. I didn't know you were home, I said. Just got in, he replied. He didn't sit down. He didn't stay. He just nodded once and walked away. I remained there, listening to the echoes of his steps fading down the hallway. I realized I no longer knew what to say to him. Not because I didn't care. But because the things I needed to say couldn't be contained in small sentences. They were too big. Too messy. Too fragile. That evening, when the sun had dipped low and the light had turned amber through the windows, I sat in the kitchen alone. My husband hadn't returned yet. The table was set for two, but I ate alone. The second plate remained untouched. After dinner, I walked outside barefoot. The grass was cool beneath my feet, slightly damp from the sprinkler system. The air smelled of soil and distant smoke. I looked up at the sky and saw the first stars begin to appear. And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't wanted to face before. What had happened couldn't be undone. But it also wasn't an accident. It was a response. To absence. To silence. To years of being unseen. And now, as the night settled around me, I wasn't afraid of what came next. Only unsure of where to begin. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm that both comforted and unsettled me. I moved through them like someone watching herself from the outside, going through routines with practiced ease but feeling as though every gesture belonged to someone else. The kitchen, the laundry room, the sunroom, all the places that had once made up the small universe of my marriage, now felt distant, as if I had already begun to step away from them in ways that couldn't be reversed. My husband was home more now. Not much more attentive, but physically present. He asked about dinner, offered small compliments, occasionally reached for my hand at the table. I let him. I nodded. I responded politely. And yet, beneath it all, I could feel the absence. The absence of connection. The absence of something that had long ago slipped quietly out the back door without either of us noticing. He didn't suspect anything. Or if he did, he had chosen not to see it. That was the way we both handled things, with silence, with avoidance, with careful rehearsals of normalcy. One afternoon, he surprised me by suggesting a weekend away. Just the two of us. The idea hung in the air between us like something fragile and unfamiliar. I agreed before I had time to think about it, mostly out of reflex. Perhaps I hoped the gesture meant something. That something could be salvaged. Or maybe I was simply too tired to say no. We drove to a quiet resort by the lake. It was the kind of place we used to go to in the early years, when things felt easier, when laughter came quickly and silences weren't so loaded. The drive was long, and we filled it with casual conversation, news, traffic, the weather. He told me about a colleague's new promotion. I nodded and pretended to care. The resort was beautiful in the way that quiet places often are, minimal noise, soft lights, the scent of pine in the air. Our room overlooked the water, and the view was undeniably peaceful. He unpacked quickly, laid out his toiletries, opened the sliding door to let the air in. I watched him move through these motions and realized how familiar they were, the same rhythm, the same order. It was strange how routine could remain intact even after intimacy had faded. That night, we had dinner in the lodge. The restaurant was half empty, the hum of conversations low and distant. Candlelight flickered between us, casting soft shadows on his face. He smiled often. Made jokes. Reached for my hand again. I smiled back, sipped my wine, nodded at the right moments. But there was a disconnect, a layer of glass between us that I couldn't reach through. Back in the room, he fell asleep quickly, his breathing steady and rhythmic. I lay beside him for a while, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft rustling of leaves outside. The bed felt too large. The silence between our bodies too wide. At some point, I got up quietly and stepped out onto the balcony. The lake shimmered under the moonlight, and the trees swayed gently in the breeze. I wrapped the blanket around my shoulders and sat down, pulling my knees up to my chest. The cold didn't bother me. I thought about the night we spent in that other hotel, the one outside the city. The weight of that silence. The steadiness of what we didn't say. The clarity in the stillness that followed. I thought about how I had allowed something to happen, not just a moment, but a shift. Something fundamental. Not because I had been seduced or pursued. But because I had needed something real. Something honest. Something unfiltered. And now, as I sat there under the stars beside a man who still believed everything was fine, I realized I could no longer pretend. Not in the way I used to. Not convincingly. The next morning, we walked around the lake before breakfast. The air was crisp, the ground soft beneath our feet. He held my hand again, and I let him, but my fingers didn't close around his. I think he noticed. He didn't say anything. Later, while he packed, I stood by the window, watching a canoe drift across the water. I felt calm. Not happy. Not sad. Just calm, the kind that comes when you stop resisting what you've known for a long time. On the way home, he talked more than usual. About work, about plans for the house, about maybe finally booking that cruise we had postponed years ago. I nodded. I smiled. But none of the words stayed with me. They passed over me like soft wind, nothing to push against, nothing to hold on to. When we pulled into the driveway, the house looked just as we left it. Still. Waiting. Inside, everything was in place. The faint scent of lavender remained. The mail was stacked neatly on the counter. Life, unchanged. I went upstairs alone, unpacked my things slowly, placed each item back in its place. My hands moved methodically, but my mind was elsewhere. Later that evening, as I stood at the sink rinsing a few glasses, I heard him laughing from the living room. Something on television. A familiar sound. One I had once loved. And yet it felt like it belonged to another life. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling one last time. I thought about what it meant to leave something behind without physically leaving. I thought about the difference between staying and remaining. And I thought about how quiet a person can become before disappearing altogether. And then, for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to imagine something else. Not an escape. Not a replacement. Just a version of myself that wasn't waiting anymore. Not waiting to be seen. Not waiting to be understood. Not waiting to feel alive again. Just ready.